Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this Game video we're going to be discussing the Scorpio again, because Phil Spencer has made an awful lot of comments over the past 24 or so hours regarding the upcoming machine. Now, we all know that E3 2017 is probably going to be about the most exciting time in the world if you're an Xbox fan, because quite frankly there is a lot of expectation on Microsoft right now to deliver the goods. Perhaps one of the more interesting sides of the Xbox Scorpio was the official revealing of the specifications. Now, I'm not, of course, talking about the very vague specifications that Microsoft first touted at E3 last year. No. We're talking about the Eurogamer specifications, the specifications which went into exhaustive depth of the machine's internals. And there were some questions as why were Microsoft doing it that way? Like, what was their thought process? There were a lot of folks who were speculating, and to be fair, I was one of them, and I don't think it was too far off the mark that Microsoft wanted not to just, have their own press conference and say, hey, this is what we're doing. Instead, they wanted to do it in a very technical manner, because one of the problems, of course, the Xbox One ran into against the PlayStation 4 was it was technically inferior, and it really got blasted in the technical press. So they didn't want that to happen anymore. Now, according to Phil Spencer, they said that they wanted the Scorpio reveal to be as authentic as possible. Therefore, they wanted to invite select members of the press, but here's the kicker. They didn't actually know how those members of the press were going to respond, which I actually have to give Microsoft credit for. They didn't say, hey, you have to write this, this and this if we're going to bring you along. There wasn't like they said to, the members of the press, we're going to actually request that you send over what you've written, what videos you've produced. Instead, they're free to interpret their own findings however they want, which I have to admit is very impressive of Microsoft. Another little nugget of information was revealed is that they actually started life working on the Scorpio by basically taking an Xbox One S and overclocking it. So essentially what they wanted to do is figure out how games would run, and obviously there was a lot of hardware emulation that Microsoft did as well. We've discussed that in the past. In another interview with The Guardian, Phil also pointed out that every game on the Scorpio will have full access to the console specifications and technical performance. I'll read out the quote because it's not too long. Every game should have full access and capabilities of the hardware, whether the game was written 2 years ago for the Xbox One, 10 years ago for the 360, or is yet to be shipped. You're going to see games that shipped on the Xbox One that just run natively better on Scorpio, because you have the CPU and GPU power, and things like scalable resolution, which Halo used. You're going to find that it's running at a high resolution a lot of the time, or all of the time, and if the team does specific work on the Scorpio, then obviously there's a ton of headroom to go do something great. So what does he mean by this? Well, it's very simple. In a lot of titles, dynamic resolution is utilised, especially on the Xbox One. What dynamic resolution basically does is if a scene becomes increasingly more complex, for example, let's say you're in a nice calm environment, there's not too much stuff to draw, then resolution goes up. However, if things start to chug a little and, the system realizes, oh crap, basically the world's just exploded and there's an awful lot of explosions, light sourcing, shadows, details, characters on screen, physics to draw, physics to calculate, and so on and so on and so on, resolution or something is going to take a hit. So basically, a lot of developers were figuring out, hey, we can do one of two things. We can either lower the resolution dynamically, or the alternative, of course, is to basically just let the frame rate tank. And I think most folks would agree that lowering the resolution dynamically from, let's say, 900p to, let's say, 792p, or from 1080p to, let's say, 900p, or whatever, is the better way to go. It possibly looks worse for just a few moments, a couple of instances, but generally this happens when the action is at its most critical. So you probably won't notice it. It's not like you're going to be literally looking at the textures that specific moment in time. So what's happening with the Scorpio is because the hardware is essentially much greater in terms of level of performance, the engine will basically just be able to use that right out the gate. So in theory, at least, that the game will run at the highest resolution that it natively was programmed to run in. Now, how I interpret that is that essentially games will be able to run, let's say it's 900p, it should be able to run at that natively, but then you've got the super sampling of the Scorpio to take into consideration as well, which, depending on how that works and how effective it is in real life, because ultimately you can make any type of claim, and to be fair to Microsoft, what we've seen so far does look fairly positive, but assume it does work how it's intended, and you know what we've seen with the demos, it should look very impressive for even older games. Phil also reveals that he has a Scorpio at home. Now that I find very interesting. I would like to know what the state of his Scorpio at home actually is. And I don't mean like does he dust it or not. I refer of course to how far along that hardware is to final retail. That's quite curious. From what we've heard from Eurogamer, it is pretty far along indeed, and they are actually manufacturing essentially the full Scorpio engine at this point, so that's pretty cool. But I more refer not just to the hardware side of things, but you know, the OS, what work is there left to do, and so on and so on. Anyway, he says that I've got higher frequencies on CPU than any other consoles, we've got a better GPU, we've got more RAM, I have a Scorpio at home, and I've moved it back and forth from a 1080p to a 4K television, and you can tell the difference if you're running on a 1080p compared to an original Xbox One, which is obviously a good thing. And once again, this brings back to downsampling and all the other stuff. Personally, I have no qualms that the Scorpio is going to be an absolute beast. It is. It's going to be a monster. Especially when one factors in the fact that it is a console at the end of the day. The GPU is considerably upclocked, it has an awful lot of RAM, it has like 9GB basically available for games. I'm sorry, 8GB for games, so I did the math wrong in my head, you can tell I'm tired. And ultimately has, of course, a much higher CPU clock as well, as some other bits and bobs in the background which lower the utilization of the CPU, such as the inclusion of DirectX 12 essentially baked into the GPU. And once again, we've discussed that quite in depth before, so I don't want to eat up too much video discussing that. My real concern for the Scorpio isn't actually the performance of the machine, it's what Microsoft can do to tempt us to the green team, and that of course really relies upon the games. My main concern right now with the Scorpio is essentially what games they've got left in the tank, because a lot of interviews with Phil, whenever he's asked, hey, what do you think about the games, he always says, that the games are going to look the best on the Scorpio, and then he'll reel off a list of games which of course are going to be released across both platforms. And don't get me wrong, I don't think he's lying. I do feel that the Xbox Scorpio versions will look the best, and objectively, if you have a higher frame rate, you're going to get better performance across that system. Unless, of course, they don't really push the frame rate. Let's say, for example, you're making, an indie game and it runs at 1080p, 60 across both titles, who cares? But, generally speaking, if it's pushing the consoles to the absolute limit, theoretically, the Scorpio will win pretty much every time. There are some subjective things you have to take into consideration, like if you hate the Scorpio's controller, and you'd much prefer the PlayStation's controller, then, subjectively, it's better to play on a PlayStation. The only issue is what have Microsoft got left in terms of exclusives that they've not revealed. They have said that there are titles that they have not revealed yet, and we all know that there are other games like Sea of Thieves and whatever else that we're waiting for, but that really is going to be the crux of the matter. To bring people into the Scorpio fold, or to the Xbox fold, really is going to be requiring one thing, and that is games. I know Phil doesn't like to get his wallet out to buy exclusives to the platform. I mean, yes, there was Rise of the Tomb Raider, but that, wasn't really an exclusive, it was a timed exclusive, and really, timed exclusives do have their place, but it's not enough to convince someone to buy an entire system for it. It's nice as kind of like, no, I get to play it before you. And if you are thinking about buying the system anyway and you're pretty much on the fence, it might convince you if you're really looking forward to that game. But it's not going to be enough to convince you if you're kind of like, it looks pretty cool. But, I'm happy to wait for a couple of months. The PlayStation 4 Pro is technically inferior, but one area it is definitely superior is the exclusives, at least in the mind of the public. Now, I'm personally hoping this is not the case. I'm personally hoping that Microsoft managed to do a lot of damage to Sony at E3. And I don't mean that in a malicious way, as in like, you know, I want the PlayStation to fail. No. Because if Microsoft counter with a whole bunch of games which are exclusive, it then of course pushes Sony to do the same thing. It means that Sony that will then be more aggressive and pursue new IPs. And I don't want Sony to just, you know, rely on The Last of Us 2 and, you know, the new Uncharted's or the new, you know, God of Wars and whatever else. And of course they're not doing that, and I don't want Microsoft to do that either. I want both companies to be extremely competitive, because ultimately that is what basically tempts people to buy games. Consoles compared to, you know, just owning one, it basically inspires them to buy another one, and I want Microsoft to be extremely competitive because I believe it's best for the industry, just how I want Nvidia and AMD to be competitive in the GPU market, how I want Intel and AMD to be competitive in the CPU market, how I don't want, you know, just Samsung to be the winners in phones. I also want, of course, Apple and LG and whomever else to be, you know, basically just trying to one-up each other every time, because it's best for us as consumers. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.